Hey, sleepless souls, welcome back to Whisper Sleep Studio. I'm Clara, your storyteller for the night. Have you ever stepped into a new home and felt a chill that wasn't from the cold, but from someone watching? That's how it began for me. In my grandmother's old farmhouse, where the silence had secrets and the walls whispered truths no one wanted to hear. So pull your blanket close, dim the lights, and get ready for a story that will crawl beneath your skin and stay in your heart long after it ends. Before we begin, tap that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's drift into the shadows together. When I first arrived at my grandmother's farmhouse, the sky looked like it had been bruised by the hands of something ancient. Heavy clouds hanging low, the air full of that still, watchful silence that only comes before rain. The road behind me was empty, a long ribbon of dirt winding back toward a world I wasn't sure I wanted to return to. For the first time in years, I felt small. I stood there with my suitcase, staring up at the old house that seemed to be waiting. It was larger than I remembered. 2 stories, white paint turned gray from decades of weather, windows framed in peeling blue trim. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the screen door swung lazily in the wind with a faint metallic squeal. But beneath all that decay, there was something beautiful about it, like a forgotten memory refusing to die. I hadn't been here since childhood, back when my grandmother, Evelyn, still filled every corner with her laughter and the scent of warm bread. Now, the laughter was gone, and I was the last of her blood left to listen to the echoes. Inside, the house smelled of old pine, lavender, and dust. So much dust it seemed to breathe when the light hit it. Every floorboard groaned underfoot like a restless sleeper. I set my suitcase down in the hallway and just stood there for a moment, listening. The silence wasn't empty. It had texture, weight. It pressed against my ears the way silence does in old churches or cemeteries, alive with something unsaid. I walked through the room slowly, touching the edges of furniture draped in white sheets, tracing the outlines of framed photographs that hung crooked on faded wallpaper. My grandmother's handwriting was still on little notes stuck to the kitchen shelves. Don't forget the cinnamon. Check the stove before bed. I smiled, but it hurt a little. I didn't realize how much I'd missed this place until that moment. The house was old enough to remember everything. That's what I kept thinking. Every sound felt deliberate, each creak and sigh like a language it had been speaking long before I was born. Maybe that's why, when I first heard the whisper, I didn't question it right away. It came that first night. I had cleaned the living room, lit a small fire, and wrapped myself in one of Grandma's quilts. The flames flickered against the old wallpaper, making the roses look alive, their shadows swaying like they were breathing. I remember closing my eyes, listening to the crackle of the wood, the faint ticking of the hall clock, and then something else. A sigh, soft, almost tender. Then a single word that didn't belong to any dream. Help. I froze. My heart stuttered. It was a woman's voice, fragile, distant, as though it came through walls too thick for time to break. I sat up and listened, every sense sharpening. The house was still again. Just the clock, the fire, the wind outside brushing against the eaves. I told myself it was nothing. Houses make sounds. Air moves through cracks. Old beams shift. But even as I whispered those reassurances, I couldn't stop glancing at the corners where shadows gathered too deeply. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows like forgiveness. I convinced myself the voice had been a trick of exhaustion, nerves, imagination. Anything but real. I made coffee, opened every curtain, and filled the rooms with light. For a moment, it worked. The house felt warmer, even welcoming. But that night, the whisper returned. Please. This time it came clearer, closer, like someone standing just behind the wall, their breath brushing the plaster. I turned on every light, checked every room, even stepped outside to look at the windows from the yard. The night was still, moonlight silvering the fields. Nothing moved but the tall grass. When I went back inside, the voice was gone. I didn't sleep. The following days passed in uneasy rhythm. I told myself I'd stay busy, organize, clean, start fixing what needed fixing. The house was falling apart in small, persistent ways. A leaky tap, loose steps, broken shutters. Every repair was a distraction. I found comfort in the rhythm of tools, in the smell of paint, in the illusion that I was restoring something instead of running from something else. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. Sometimes, while sweeping, I'd feel cold air move across the back of my neck, like a breath. Other times, I'd hear faint music, a hum or a lullaby that faded as soon as I tried to listen closely. One evening, while the last bit of daylight melted into orange, I decided to explore the second floor properly. I walked through each room, opening windows that had been shut for years. Most were empty, except for dust and spiderwebs, until I reached the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was stuck at first, swollen from years of humidity, but it opened with a reluctant groan. The smell inside was different. Damp, faintly metallic. The wallpaper here was faded with a pattern of climbing roses, and in the center stood an old bed frame without a mattress. Dust lay thick over everything, but what struck me most was the air. It was colder, heavier. That was when I heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but a sound like soft tapping, 3 times, deliberate, from somewhere behind the far wall. I waited, barely breathing. Then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I stepped closer, pressing my ear against the wall. Nothing. Only silence. But I could swear it felt warm beneath my fingertips, as though something on the other side was alive. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother for the first time in years. She was standing in the kitchen, her back to me, humming the same lullaby I'd sometimes heard faintly in the walls. When I tried to speak to her, she turned, but her face wasn't hers. It was someone else's, a young woman with hollow eyes. I woke before dawn, covered in sweat, the sound of my heartbeat loud in the silence. And somewhere in the dark, as the first light crept through the window, I heard that soft voice again, so close it could have been inside my head. Find me. I sat up slowly, staring into the dim light. I didn't know who she was or what she wanted. All I knew was that this house, the one that had stood so quietly for so long, was remembering something it could no longer keep buried, and I was beginning to understand that I hadn't come here by chance. The whisper beneath the wallpaper. The next morning, the world outside seemed perfectly ordinary. The sky was clear, birds moved across the fence posts, and the fields behind the house glimmered with dew. But the calm felt dishonest, like a smile that hides a secret. I walked through the rooms again, this time listening more carefully. The house made its usual symphony of groans and sighs, but underneath it, I could sense something more deliberate. A rhythm, a pattern, as though the air itself was trying to speak in a language I hadn't yet learned. I made coffee and carried it into the guest room, the one with the climbing roses on the walls. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards, but the chill in the air lingered. I traced a finger along the wallpaper, noticing how uneven it felt. There were places where it bubbled slightly, as though the wall beneath had swollen from moisture, or perhaps from something else. As I pressed lightly, the paper shifted beneath my palm. A faint scent rose, dust, mold, and something faintly sweet like dried lavender. My grandmother had always used lavender in everything. For a moment, the memory of her came so strongly I could almost see her standing in the doorway, smiling. But then, a draft brushed my neck. The smile vanished. I turned slowly. The window was shut. That was when I noticed it. A small tear in the wallpaper, near the corner of the room. Just a thin slit, no longer than my thumb, curling upward like a smile. I leaned closer. The edges were darkened, as though someone had tried to seal it again. And there, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, came a sound, a whisper. Clara, my name. I stumbled back so fast the coffee spilled across the floor, dark and spreading like a shadow. My breath came shallow, every hair on my arms standing up. For several long seconds I couldn't move. The voice had been soft, but it carried the kind of weight only truth has. When I finally gathered the courage to move closer again, I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. Only silence. But the silence had texture, like a held breath. I should have left it alone. I knew that. But curiosity has its own gravity. That afternoon, I fetched a small knife from the kitchen and began to peel back the wallpaper from that corner. The sound of tearing paper echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Beneath the faded roses lay something unexpected. A thin wooden panel, painted over, but newer than the rest of the wall. It didn't belong to the house's original structure. I tapped it lightly, hollow. A thrill of fear and fascination ran through me. I pried at the edges until a seam appeared, barely visible, but enough to fit the blade. It resisted at first, then gave way with a soft click. A section of the panel swung outward, revealing a dark, narrow cavity filled with dust and the faint smell of something old and forgotten. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I hesitated before reaching for it, half expecting the air itself to shift. When I finally lifted it out, the fabric nearly disintegrated in my hands. Something fell loose and landed softly on the floor with a thud. A leather-bound book, its spine cracked and the cover worn to softness. A diary. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, heart pounding, and opened it carefully. The first page bore a date written in delicate, looping handwriting, May 3rd, 1952. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were clear enough. Open quote, "I don't know if I can forgive myself for what we've done to Margaret." Close quote. I frowned. The name meant nothing to me. My grandmother, Evelyn, had never mentioned a Margaret. In all the stories she'd told me about her youth, her parents, her brother Thomas, never once had she spoken that name. I turned the page. Open quote. "She's locked in the attic again. Mother says it's for her own good. I can hear her crying at night, but Father says it's just the wind. I tell myself he's right, but the sound doesn't stop." Close quote. My throat tightened as I read. Entry after entry spilled out guilt and desperation. Evelyn's words were trembling confessions caught between love and fear. Open quote. "Margaret says she sees someone in the walls. She says there's a light behind the boards. I told her she's imagining it, but now I hear it too, a faint tapping when the house goes quiet, like something wanting to be remembered." Close quote. By the time I reached the last page, the handwriting had changed. Uneven, panicked, the ink smeared by tears or shaking hands. Open quote. "She stopped speaking yesterday. The silence is worse than the crying. I think she's dying." I begged Father to let her out. He said it's too late. He said she brought this upon herself. Close quote. My hands were trembling. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice in those words, so full of guilt it bled through time. The final line was barely legible, written in hurried strokes that trailed off the page. Open quote. "If anyone ever finds this, forgive me." Close quote. I didn't move for a long time. The house around me felt impossibly still, as though it too were holding its breath. Outside, the light was fading. A slow wind moved through the trees, brushing against the windows with a sound that almost resembled weeping. And then, just as I was closing the diary, I heard it again. From behind the wall, faint but unmistakable, 3 taps, then a whisper, trembling and low. "Find me." I dropped the book, stumbling back against the bed frame, the sound ringing in my ears. It was her. It had to be. Margaret. The temperature in the room fell sharply. My breath fogged in front of me, and in the corner of the mirror hanging on the opposite wall, I saw movement, a flicker of white fabric, a shadow where there should have been none. I turned, heart pounding, nothing there. Only the dim outline of the window and the faint reflection of my own terrified face. The whisper came again, softer now, closer. "Please, find me." And for the first time since I'd arrived, I said it out loud. "I hear you." The moment the words left my mouth, the house seemed to exhale. The window pane rattled. Somewhere deep inside the walls, something creaked as though a lock had turned. I didn't understand it yet, but I had just answered a call that had waited more than 70 years to be heard. Part 3. The room in the attic. That night, I barely slept. The diary sat on my bedside table, its presence impossible to ignore. Every time I closed my eyes, the words replayed in my mind like an echo I couldn't silence. "She's locked in the attic again. I hear her crying at night. Find me." The farmhouse, which had once felt lonely but harmless, now seemed alive in a different way. Every creak, every sigh of the wind against its wooden ribs felt intentional, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. By morning, a thin layer of mist had settled over the hills. The air was sharp, the kind that burns your lungs when you step outside. I made myself a cup of coffee, hands shaking, staring out the kitchen window as if the landscape might offer an answer. The fields looked endless, but beneath their beauty, I could almost sense the weight of everything buried there. Secrets, grief, guilt. This land had soaked in decades of silence, and I could feel it watching. I knew where I had to go. The attic. It was strange. Though I'd lived in the house for over a week, I hadn't stepped foot up there yet. Something about it had always felt off. The door at the top of the staircase was painted shut, and even before the diary, I'd had no desire to open it. But now, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and a small crowbar from the shed, and with a deep breath, climbed the narrow stairs. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the faint smell of cedar and old fabric. The door loomed ahead, its white paint cracked like the skin of something ancient. For a moment, I hesitated, feeling a strange pressure in my chest, as if the house itself were warning me not to continue. But curiosity, no duty, pulled me forward. The crowbar wedged easily beneath the frame. The paint cracked with a sound that made my stomach twist. I pushed harder, and with a groan that echoed down the hallway, the door gave way. A wave of air spilled out, heavy with dust and something else. Something stale and human. I lifted the flashlight. Its beam cut through a cloud of swirling particles, revealing a narrow space filled with old trunks, furniture draped in sheets, and 1,000 forgotten fragments of time. The wooden beams above were dark with age. Cobwebs glistened like threads of silver. But beyond the clutter, in the far corner, was something that didn't fit. A wall that didn't belong. I moved closer, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. The wall was newer than the rest, smooth boards where there should have been rough beams. It stretched from floor to ceiling, sealing off what looked like a small section of the attic. The diary's words echoed again in my mind. They locked her in the attic. She said she saw someone in the walls. My hands were trembling as I pressed against the boards. Hollow. The crowbar slid easily into the seam between two panels. I hesitated for just a heartbeat before prying one loose. The sound was deafening in the silence. A groan, then a crack, then the sigh of stale air rushing out after 70 years of being trapped. Behind the boards was a small, dark room. I stepped inside slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The space was barely large enough for a person to stand. A thin, discolored mattress lay on the floor, its fabric torn open. The walls were marked with deep, desperate scratches, dozens of them, gouged into the wood by fingernails or something sharp. Some formed words, though they were hard to read. One word, however, stood out, carved over and over until it was almost burned into the wood. Free. The air was so cold I could see my breath. I crouched near the mattress, my heart pounding. A small wooden box sat in the corner, coated in dust. When I opened it, I found drawings, sketches done in pencil, delicate and haunting. A girl with soft eyes, a man with rough hands, fields of wildflowers, and a baby. The same baby appeared again and again, in different poses, different seasons, always held in the arms of a young woman. Margaret. The drawings were so beautiful, so full of emotion that my eyes blurred with tears. She had poured her soul into them. Then I saw something else. Beneath the sketches, folded carefully, was a small piece of paper. It wasn't part of the diary, but the handwriting was the same. Evelyn's. Open quote, "If you ever find her, forgive me. I thought I could keep her safe by keeping her hidden. But silence is a crueler prison than walls." Close quote. I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by grief, confusion, and horror. The woman who'd taught me kindness, who'd baked me cookies as a child, had helped imprison her own sister. But before I could dwell on it further, a sound froze me in place. A whisper. "Clara." It came from behind me, low and trembling. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking so badly the beam danced across the walls. The air shimmered, just slightly like heat rising from asphalt. And for a split second I saw her. A figure, pale and thin, standing in the doorway. Her hair long and tangled, her dress old-fashioned and torn. Her eyes, hollow but bright, fixed on me. I gasped, stumbling backward. The light flickered, then died, plunging the room into darkness. In the blackness, her voice came again, no longer a whisper. "You opened the door." I could barely breathe. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. A pause, then softly, "Forgotten." The air around me grew colder still, biting against my skin. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and switched it on, but when the light returned, she was gone. Only the air shimmered faintly, and a few of the sketches had shifted positions, scattered across the floor as though brushed by invisible hands. My knees gave out. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move. The light from the single attic window dimmed as the sun sank behind the hills, painting everything in bruised colors. When I finally rose, I whispered, I'll find you. And the faintest echo answered back from the walls themselves, find me. The night after the attic discovery, the house no longer felt like wood and stone. It felt alive, listening. The air thickened with quiet, heavy anticipation, as though the walls themselves waited for me to speak Margaret's name again. I tried to ignore it, bury myself in sketches and research, but every pencil stroke on paper began to mirror her hand, her curves, her faint touch from the past. The portraits she once drew haunted me. And worse, they began to change. I had pinned one of her sketches on my studio wall for reference, a woman standing beside an oak tree. That morning, when I woke, the sketch had altered subtly. Her eyes now turned toward me. Her hand, once resting on her lap, was reaching out. I froze, breathless, because the pencil lines were unmistakably mine, yet I had never drawn them. The wind groaned through the window cracks, as if exhaling her name. The night after, I couldn't sleep. Rain drummed against the roof, water slipping through the eaves, sounding almost like distant footsteps above. I grabbed a candle and went downstairs. The house was breathing. I could hear faint scratching under the floorboards. I pressed my ear to the old pine planks. Nothing. Then suddenly a long, slow drag, as though something were being moved beneath me. "Margaret?" I whispered. The sound stopped. Silence folded around me, heavy and suffocating. Then, faintly, a soft hum floated upward. A tune I recognized. The same melody Margaret's niece mentioned in her letters, a lullaby about the river that took her. My candle flickered low, the flame bending toward the floor as if pulled by invisible breath. That's when I saw it, the faintest shadow under the cracks, darker than night, moving. I stumbled backward, heart hammering. The house groaned in answer, a timber crying out like a wounded creature. Something deep beneath shifted. The humming grew louder, filling the walls until it became a chorus of whispers, hundreds of them overlapping, names and cries and laughter all twisting into one another. I clutched my chest, gasping for air, and then silence again. I could hear my own heartbeat echo. I ran upstairs, slammed the bedroom door, and leaned against it, trembling. But on the other side, I heard 3 soft knocks. Tap, 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 deliberate, patient. I whispered, "What do you want from me?" A voice, faint and broken like wind through reeds, replied, "To finish what I began." When I dared to open the door, no one was there. But on the hallway wall, someone, or something, had drawn a single charcoal line down to the floorboards. It led to a loose plank. I hesitated, the world spinning around me, but curiosity has always been my curse. I fetched a chisel and pried it open. Beneath lay an old metal box, rusted shut. Inside, wrapped in brittle paper, was a small glass vial sealed with wax. Inside that vial swirled what looked like black water, or ink. But when the candlelight hit it, it shimmered faintly, almost alive. A faint note lay beside it. "For whoever finds this, remember me kindly." I don't know why I did it, but I felt compelled to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the vial, the entire house seemed to exhale, and I fell to my knees. My vision blurred. I was no longer in the present. I saw flashes. Margaret standing by the riverbank, sketchbook clutched to her chest, tears streaking her face. A man shouting her name, his figure distorted by rain. A hand shoving her sketchbook falling open, pages scattering like white birds into the wind. Then water, cold, endless water swallowing her voice. I gasped and the vision shattered. I was back in my room, trembling, the vial still glowing faintly in my hand. The whispering returned, softer this time, closer. I turned toward the mirror, and in its reflection, the room behind me shifted. The bed, the candle, everything was there. But I wasn't alone. A figure stood beside me, her face pale, her eyes hollow yet kind. Margaret. She didn't speak, but her lips formed silent words I somehow understood. "You found me." Tears burned my eyes. "What happened to you?" I whispered. She looked toward the floor, toward where I had found the box, and then the mirror cracked. A single line running across it like a wound. The candle went out. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness and the faint sound of my heartbeat. Then I heard something beneath the floor again. But this time, it wasn't scratching. It was breathing. Long, slow, human. My legs gave way and I crawled back, clutching the wall, whispering prayers I'd long forgotten. Then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped and the air stilled as though she had left. But I knew she hadn't. Margaret was no longer just beneath the floor or in the walls. She was somewhere else. Closer. watching through my own eyes. The next morning, sunlight poured in as though nothing had happened. But when I sat at my desk to draw, my hand moved before I could think. Lines appeared, fast, confident, as if guided by another will. When I stopped, the page revealed a face. Hers. And beneath it, words written in trembling script. The river remembers. That phrase, the river remembers, clung to me like a curse. I couldn't shake it. Even as I stepped outside that morning, sunlight spilling through the fog, my breath still trembled with the echo of her words. The river lay not far beyond the trees, a ribbon of glass winding through the valley. Locals called it the Widow's Veil, after the mist that curled above it each dawn, thick as sorrow. As I walked closer, the sound of rushing water grew louder. Yet beneath it, I swore I could hear whispers. Each footstep felt heavier, as though the earth resisted me, warning me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something inside was pulling me forward, as if an unseen hand guided me back to where Margaret's story ended. The grass near the bank was damp, littered with white petals. Wild jasmine, fragile and fragrant. The air shimmered with an unnatural stillness, and for a brief second, I thought I saw movement beneath the surface. A pale hand drifting upward, fingers curling before fading into the current. My heart pounded. I stumbled back, breath catching. Then, almost as if summoned by that moment, I saw something half buried in the mud. A broken piece of wood, carved with initials, MH. I picked it up carefully, mud dripping down my wrist. It was the edge of an old sketchbook cover, her sketchbook. The same one I saw in my vision. I took it home, wrapped in cloth, and cleaned it gently by the window. The smell of river and decay clung to it. Inside, the pages were nearly dissolved by water, but faint outlines remained. Sketches of faces, the manor, and one image repeated over and over. A dark figure by the river, always watching her from the distance. The final drawing was unfinished, a self-portrait of Margaret with wide, terrified eyes. Beneath it, words written in trembling ink. He follows even in death. My pulse quickened. Whoever he was, he had been real. Maybe the one who'd pushed her, the shadow in my visions. That night, as I read through the surviving letters I'd found earlier, a pattern began to form. Margaret's last weeks were filled with fear. She wrote about a visitor who came each night, knocking on her door and whispering from the garden. She said she saw his reflection in the mirror, though no one stood behind her. Her final note, written days before her death, read, "If I disappear, look for me where the river bends." My blood ran cold. The river bend lay right behind my property. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every flicker of the candle felt like her hand passing before the flame. Around midnight, thunder rolled across the hills, and the wind rattled the window panes like a desperate plea. I lit another candle and opened her sketchbook again. That's when I noticed something new. Faint writing on the inside of the back cover, invisible under normal light but now shimmering faintly, as if reacting to the flame. It spelled out one word, below. I remembered the vial, that black ink-like liquid I'd found beneath the floorboards. I fetched it, set it on my desk, and when I turned the sketchbook toward it, the pages rippled slightly, as though breathing. Without thinking, I unsealed the wax and dipped my brush into the strange fluid. It wasn't ink. It was colder, heavier, alive. As soon as it touched the page, the drawings began to move. The figure by the river straightened, her hair flowing, her eyes opening wide. Margaret, staring directly at me. The shadows behind her shifted, forming a man's silhouette. A voice spoke, not aloud, but in my mind. "He still walks." My candle flickered violently, and the room grew icy. The mirror across the hall trembled on its nail, then fell, shattering into silver shards. I could see her reflection in every piece. Margaret standing behind me, closer now, her expression no longer sorrowful but urgent. "He must not rise again," she whispered, her voice echoing like wind over water. "He waits beneath the river." The next morning, I returned to the river bend. The fog was thick as milk, swallowing sound. I found the place she had described, a small hollow where the current slowed. The earth there looked freshly disturbed. I dug with my hands until my nails bled, and soon I struck something hard. A wooden box, waterlogged and rotting. Inside was a pocket watch, a man's ring, and a piece of cloth embroidered with Margaret's initials. But the watch, it was still ticking. My stomach twisted as I realized what it meant. Whoever had killed her hadn't left empty-handed. Something of him remained here. As I held the watch, the air around me changed. The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped so sharply that frost formed on the grass. From across the river, a figure appeared. Tall, dark, featureless. I couldn't see a face, but I knew instinctively that it was him, the man from her sketches, the one who had ended her story. I stepped back, heart racing, the watch trembling in my hand. The figure began to move toward me, not walking but gliding over the water's surface. I dropped the watch and ran, branches tearing at my clothes, the sound of water roaring behind me like a living thing. When I burst through the manor door, gasping, the candlelight flickered, and there, standing in the center of my room, was Margaret. She looked different. Her face was calm now, almost serene. "You found him," she whispered. "Now you must find him." I tried to ask how, but she raised her hand, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't fully human anymore. The air shimmered around her, edges dissolving like smoke. "The ink," she said softly. "It was made from the river's blood. Use it, or he will take you next." Her words faded, and she vanished. I stood alone, trembling, the black vial gleaming faintly on the desk. Whatever she wanted me to do, I knew the next night would decide everything, whether the river would finally forget or claim another memory.